All right, here's the first lesson, Chapter 4, Life in the Colonies, Colonial Society is Chapter 4. We're going to link it into Chapter 3 with the establishment of the colonies and settlement of the colonies. You should set up your title page and a timeline, even a thematic spec chart here for this chapter coming up, and then you can go ahead and insert the materials here that I've given you for Lesson 1. We're looking at the importance right away of the middle passage for our essential question here today, and the characteristics of slave life in the 18th century. This chart shows the slave trade during this 18th and 19th century here that was triggered by the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish, also engaged in by the British, where most people went to the Americas. You can see it's heavily in Central and South America by a long shot. Lots of work to be done over there in those colonial mines that are feeding the mother countries for their factories and building up their treasuries and the gold bullion and the money and the wealth and that mercantilist system we've talked about before. This would be a nice left side chart here. You could go ahead and bullet some information on that middle passage, reading through lesson 1 a little bit and reviewing what we have here today. We'll also watch a little video clip of that when we get to class next time to kind of solidify what that is all about and what that experience is. So this is a significant aspect of how work in the colonial world is developing and growing. The South and slavery is really, of course, tied together here. Geography and the environment and the soil and the land is ripe for agriculture, and these people are being brought in for agricultural cash crop production. Slavery is the main reason for the success of the economy of the South. Most slaves are living on large plantations, several hundred to thousands of acres. These are plantations and massive factory farms, you might say, growing cash crops like rice, tobacco, indigo. Later on here, a little bit more cotton as we get into the 19th century. That is making huge amounts of money. It's making slaves affordable, and they are growing in wealth, and as they grow in wealth, more slaves are desired. As we talked about before, the southern colonies have these slave codes that control the workforce down there, rules for the relationship between whites and slaves themselves. What is it that's going to be out there for punishments if they act a particular way, dealing with runaways, that kind of thing. This governs life as a slave in the South. Keep in mind, slavery does exist in the North, but economically it's not as fitting, it's not nearly as common there, but it is allowed. And with slavery, this whole experience of coming to the New World involves basically being put on the auction block, just like any other particular thing or animal. You're observed, they're stripped down, are they healthy, are they injured, how old are they, how young are they, man, woman, child, it all impacted the sale price, treated no different than animal and cattle, suffering significantly from harsh treatment, of course, on the middle passages we'll see and here. But families are torn apart in this process throughout their entire lifespan. This is something a slave would experience, seeing people torn and sent to other owners, so on and so forth. And what they do is they basically develop their own little family structures in which families and other family members take on the role of mother or father. It could be a grandfather, could be an aunt, could be an uncle, could be a family friend, but they really set up their own kind of a little system to try and support that family structure. And they also bring their cultures from Africa and to America, and the cultures of African Americans blend in with the cultures of Europeans and with Native Americans in some instances. And so we have this melding of cultures here that is happening here in the New World. Some slaves did experience different things compared to other slaves. It all kind of depended on your owner and the attitude and the mentality of your owner. None of it was pleasant, but some owners were more harsh than others. Some did learn some skilled trades as workers, so like being a blacksmith or a shoemaker or something to that effect. Some slaves, depending on the colony as well, the further north you went, the more likely this was possible, could possibly buy their freedom over time with an agreement from their master. being allowed to buy and sell maybe a few things on their own, but this is largely something that is something you would see in the southern states or even in the north. And these slaves, once they're freed, they kind of developed their own communities because they weren't allowed necessarily to live amongst whites freely or the same as anyone else. They kind of were very self-reliant, and living free in white society was not easy then either. Southern society, you can see this pyramid is something we've talked about before. Top down, in Southern society, you have merchant ship owners, some clergy members, landed gentry, the aristocrats who own big pieces of land. These are the people that have large slave holdings up here in terms of landed gentry and plantation owners. And then you get down into small farmers, landowning farmers, poor whites as well who don't own slaves, indentured servants, and of course enslaved people who, as we talked about before at Bacon's Rebellion, and improving conditions in Europe and in England are taking over the population in terms of that labor force that's needed in indentured servitude, not nearly as interesting as it was once before. Not so many people willing to come over and do that really hardcore work. But most slaveholders had plantations, and the largest slaveholders were plantations. 12% of all slaveholders had plantations with 20 or more slaves. Yet more than half of those slaves lived on these plantations. So what does that tell you about the organization of the South's economy and society? Where is it heavy? It's heavy with a small number of landed white people and plantation owners who control the economy, bring in the most money in cash. They also kind of drive what society is like. One of those people, some of those people, we'll talk about here in a second. Where are most of these plantations? Most of these plantations are in this location, in this place called the Tidewater. And one of them that is significant that we'll talk about in a second is George Washington's Mount Vernon. It is right, if you get the arrow to come up, right there, Washington, D.C., that little square right there. But this Tidewater is low-lying, marshy, access to rivers and streams where cash crops can be grown here and they can be shipped out these rivers and these waterways onto the high seas and out to the rest of the colonies and the rest of the world. And they're very wealthy. These are some of the oldest families settling in here, acquiring through, if you remember in Virginia here that we're looking at, this is Maryland, that massive amount of land through the headright system. The more people they brought over, the more land they got. The more land they got, the more they raised for cash crops, and the more money they made, thus more slaves. Eventually here, as we get into that, into the 18th century, this small number of people controls the South economically and politically. They're the ones who are in the House of Burgesses, for example, in Virginia, and in all the other southern states in their state legislatures, colonial legislatures, excuse me, we're not the states yet, getting there, but colonial legislatures being heavily controlled by these people, and their interests are what is being protected and promoted. This is Mount Vernon, off to the left. This is his back porch. And down the hill here is the Potomac River, where off to the left and toward you would be the Atlantic, or the Atlantic is to your back as you're looking at this video, to the east. And this is what one of those mansions kind of looks like. There it is, the Potomac River. You can see a very large land holding here. If you ever get the chance to go there, you can see that this particular plantation is a factory in itself. It produces everything it needs. It's self-sustaining for the most part. They've got different slaves, several hundred slaves here, producing anything that anyone would need or any slave worker would need on that farm. And it is basically, again, a self-sufficient little society and production factory of cash crops of a variety of different things. And George Washington was in a variety of different things. So if you ever get a chance to see this, you need to see this. This is a picture of his grist mill. In there, a big water wheel, where on this side there is about a 2-mile long canal that was dug by slaves, and that water that came in that canal fell into a system here that helped turn this big water wheel and turn the big stone that ground up all of his grain, his wheat, his corn, that off to the right was then sometimes distilled over here in his little whiskey distillery and then sold for cash profit in the colonies and in Europe. So that's an example of a plantation, several thousand acres there with George Washington's Mount Vernon. The backcountry, as you move inland, geography and environment drive things, right? So as you move inland, it gets a little hilly, more hilly, a little rougher in a way, still pretty good soil, but this is a little bit less functional for farming. It can function, but it's farmed by people who are newly coming to the new world, not as old, not as established, maybe smaller in size in terms of farms, poorer people to begin with. Can have some farms there, supportive of slavery, bringing enough money to buy slaves, but not nearly as much as what you see over here, right? And as we continue to move inland, we have these Allegheny mountains, Appalachian mountain systems, where in mountains you just don't grow stuff, and so therefore lots of slaves, few slaves, some keep moving inward, very few. And so if you're here and you're a Virginian, you might not be as slave-minded as, if you look at this is West Virginia today. This used to be all of Virginia before the Civil War. These people really didn't have slaves much at all because it didn't pay. They couldn't grow things enough to pay for them. We have kind of different societies going on here a little bit. So there is some in that back country. All right, again, picture an image of social structure of the South. Your home learning should also be then to, again, as we talked about in class, completing that 4-1 matrix for the colonial region that you were assigned to with your group, to compare and contrast the 3 colonial regions in those 3 categories. When we get into class, we'll start working on our mega mind maps and present those to class and discuss the characteristics of each of these regions and kind of review what's there and present that to everybody so everybody else can keep working on their matrix so that we are familiar with those characteristics of those 3 regions. Again, for your online map quiz, make sure that you are doing this work first before you complete that quiz. See you next time.